Now we have a presentation of the SAS company, our platinum sponsor. Davide Palanza is with us. Hello, David. How are you?
Hello, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me here.
Do you have also nice weather like we in Serbia?
Yeah, here it's super sunny, and it's weirdly, strange here in Milan to have this weather, but I mean, we're enjoying that. So
okay, so you're ready for the topic today, personal
super
data
ready.
Compliance Governance SAS perspective.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Very nice topic. We would like to see what is your perspective regarding data compliance governance. David, can you tell me more about your topic just for the beginning, a little bit about you, please?
Yeah, for sure. I will start also sharing my screen if that's okay.
Yeah. Okay, perfect.
Okay, can you all see my screen?
Yes, perfect. Just give us full screen, please.
Yeah. Okay,
is it
perfect.
Possible?
Okay, so
okay,
I will try to squeeze this.
Now it's fine.
Okay.
Thank you very
much.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you all for having me here, and I'm super excited about today's talk. I'm Davide Palanza. I'm a customer advisor here at SAS, and specifically, I'm part of the centralized governance team related with the strategic accounts. So I'm in charge of helping, giving my support for all the commercial initiatives that have to do with this strategic accounts, both within the finance industry and the telco as well. So in the upcoming 40 minutes or so, my talk is going to be centered around data protection law, and specifically how organization can not only comply with the regulation norm, but also ultimately derive trust in the way that their personal data is towards consumers, in the way that their personal data is handled throughout the overall life cycle, starting from collection, storage, and disposal. So we're actually, kind of changing the flip of the story, because we're actually going to demonstrate that that GDPR, data protection law, is not just a compliance constraint, but it's actually also a way for organizations to really differentiate themselves, within the market space. So as the colleague has just said, there's lots of content today, so bear with me, and hopefully we're gonna have Q&A sessions in the end, so feel free to ask me any questions or maybe contact me afterwards if you want to. So
I would say it would be a nice journey video, okay? Perfect.
Yeah. I also want to say an interesting aspect that I really feel it's a good message to give out there. As much as the data protection, the current data protection law, the General Data Protection Regulation (GDPR), came into force in 2018. So people might think that it's not a recent conversation, but I think it actually is. If you think about ever-rising, technologies, if you think about cloud big applications, big data applications, Internet of Things, and mostly artificial intelligence. So I think it's interesting because these technologies are rooted on underlying principles that might actually clash with data protection principles. Take, for instance, the lawfulness principle of GDPR, the idea that in order to basically start data collection, you need to have the legitimate basis of consent. And I think that, I'm sure that you all think the same, that all the times that we browse on the web, I don't think there is a crystal clear transparency about all the information that we're giving out there, Or if you think about the purpose limitation principle, the idea that for each data processing, for each information that any organization has about us, they need to have a purpose in mind, right? And I think here that any machine learning specialist will literally scream, because I mean it's against the nature of machine learning itself. Machine learning is all about getting to figure out things about your data that you didn't know beforehand, and of course it's a challenge. Or even if you think about the idea of data minimization, according to which basically you should collect as little information as possible, and the data processing should always be limited to the required extent. I don't know you, but I think that I've never seen a data scientist, just coming to me and tell me, I'm gonna delete this information because it's not helpful anymore. Because the idea here is that you might utilize information for other purposes. And of course, it's a problem that needs to be challenged. So the kind of like, a message that I want to give out there is that I think that today is more than relevant to talk about personal data governance. Even, I think more relevantly than before, considering these technologies, the rising of these technologies. So in terms of content of this speech, I will start by recapping all together, what were the highlights that, GDPR brought, in the conversation. And then I will, touch on briefly what I think has been the impact of this regulation on organizations. And I will touch on which I think are the open challenges that I see fit, starting from 2021 going forward. And then, of course, I will link that with SAS, with our positioning, the way that SAS, is aimed to provide organizations with a one-stop shop environment in order to encompass all the application needs that might be rooted on the idea of personal data compliance and governance. Of course, we're going to get a little bit into the nitty-gritty. So we're not going to, of course, go into the details, technical details about anything, but we're going to see that this idea, let's say, of personal data compliance and governance might be really decomposed in four main, pillars. We're going to talk about personal data discovery and how can SAS leverage on artificial intelligence in order to expedite the identification of personal data. We're going to talk about personal data compliance. So how can organizations demonstrate compliance towards the data protection authorities, and how can SAS support in helping organizations orchestrating all the new processes that are envisioned by the current data protection law. And we're going to talk briefly about data governance, so how to implement a certain data strategy and how can technology support with that. And we're going to also talk about data protection, so how can we enforce protection security. So there's a lot of content. Let's start with the first slide. Okay, so the first thing that I would like to say here is that if we had to summarize, and give, a highlight message about GDPR, I think it's interesting to see the recent evolution that data protection laws have, gone through. If you think, in fact, that GDPR was a replacement of a data protection directive that came into force in 1995. And as being a directive, of course, it didn't have, let's say, mandatory enforcement power. It needed to be implemented in virtue of concrete national laws. And this led, of course, to a somewhat heterogeneity in terms of data protection practices across the different European member states. And of course, this, ultimately, led to confusion and, hampering, basically, international trade, international collaboration. So that was not good. So this is where, GDPR kicks in, this is where GDPR enters the scene, and with the single encompassing objective of harmonizing the data protection practices across all the European member states, and in order to foster collaboration, foster trade, and so on. And GDPR was a game changer on so many levels, but let's see briefly which were the main highlights. First of all, strengthening of data subjects' rights. This is an interesting aspect because now the whole idea of GDPR is there is a strong focus on people, right? So data protection is all about humans. And now data subjects, namely any natural person, has now the right to, whose personal data basically is held by private companies, public authorities, has now the right to get explanations, the right to access, get explanations and understanding about what is the data that is held about them, why is that data held, and mostly having the right to ask for rectification in case that data is inaccurate, or maybe asking the deletion of that information, the right to be forgotten. And interestingly, GDPR also introduces what's called right to portability, which is interesting because it means that basically now natural people, data subjects have now the right to ask for the moving of data, of their personal data, from one internet portal to another, which has really interesting, consequences. The second aspect that GDPR introduced is around the special protection of children, which is good, of course, because being now internet, available to anyone at any potential age, of course, the regulators decided to take a stand on this and decided that up to 16 years old, in order for the young person to access internet, he needed to have the declaration of consent coming from the legal guardians. And here, interestingly, GDPR introduces an open clause, which basically means that each country can further decide to whether to, lower that age threshold down to 13 years old if they want to. Thirdly, we have I think this is a buzzword that everyone mentions sometimes. This is the idea of privacy by design and privacy by default, which actually is not as new as people think, in terms of the fact that the Data Protection Directive already mentioned the implementation of such mechanisms. But the interesting thing now is that they now take a legally binding nature, which basically means that organizations are meant to implement measures of these kinds. And as much as technical they might appear, of course, it's all about pseudonymization, anonymization, and so on. But as much technical as they sound, actually, they're all about the idea that GDPR requirements should be taken into account since the design and development of products and services. So products and services should be, preset in such a way that the data that they utilize is limited to the required extent. And interestingly here is that GDPR doesn't say, what's the baseline in terms of legal requirements. So it's interesting here to see that there's been lots of, struggling, for organizations in order to understand whether they have reached that bar or not. Another buzzword that was introduced with GDPR is the concept of data protection impact assessment, namely the idea that for specific data processings that involve high risks in terms of data subject rights and freedoms, of course, the legality of the data processing itself has to be assessed beforehand. And this is interesting, because data protection impact assessment is not meant to be a one-off thing. You do it and then you're good. No, it has to be something that it should be continuously be performed, because the regulations change, of course, and also what is personal and what is protected might change. And then another interesting fact is the idea of extended territorial scope application. In fact, this is the game changer aspect of GDPR. I think GDPR doesn't only apply to European-based organizations, but it could apply to any organization on a worldwide level. Any organization that is interested in offering products and services to European citizens. And in order to do so, they need to collect and store and keep personal data about them. And this is interesting because non-European organizations before then, non-European organizations were not abiding by the local, let's say, data protection practices, ultimately jeopardizing European citizens' rights. And the last concept is really, interesting, given this one, because this regulation for the first time has teeth, which basically means that in accordance with the type of violation, the fines could amount up to 20 million euros or 4% of the worldwide annual turnover, whichever is greater. So it's interesting here because this is actually meant to deter organizations from not abiding to the data protection practice. Now I would want to just throw some ideas about the impact that I feel GDPR had on organizations. And I think that as a first idea that it has been 3 tremendously easy years for organizations that of course had to implement, administrative, organizational, technical measures to comply with GDPR. But I think also for regulators as well, because it required lots of efforts in order to implement GDPR. And in terms of, let's say, from the organization perspective, I think that the kind of effort, that was required in order to comply with GDPR was really varying in accordance with the country data protection maturity in the starting point. So I think that countries like Germany, for example, I think this country was really advanced in terms of data protection approach even before GDPR. So I think it was less impactful for this country than others, for example. In terms of impact for organizations, I think I would like to share 3 ideas. The first one is that what I see is that security and privacy are now in front of mind of any organization. And this is interesting because it has an inward perspective in the way, of course, that the organization looks at its own processes, in the way that data is handled, you know. But it's interesting because it also has an outward, let's say, consequence in the way that vendors, suppliers, sub-processors are scrutinized continuously, even getting sometimes probing questions in terms of security posture and the way that data is handled. And secondly, I think that security is not only, you know, in front of mind, but it's also integrated now in the business operations, ultimately enabling organizations to have the opportunity to rethink and modernize the IT environment, ultimately in order to get one basic need, which is the need of continuous, you know, curating the data set, the data they have, in order to, you know, be able to answer questions about what is the data that you have, why do you have that data, for how long do you intend to keep it? These are the, you know, tricky questions that, of course, you know, are the core, you know, foundation of GDPR. And ultimately, as I was, you know, saying before, I think that as much as a compliance constraint, it actually also enables organizations to, you know, to promote brand reputation, market acknowledgement in the way that data is handled. I mean, this is not surprising if you think about, you know, the damaging impact that scandals about data breaches had on organizations. So it's interesting to see, you know, this change of play for this regulatory aspect. In terms of open challenges that I see fit, I try to summarize in 5 main ideas. The first one is revolving around data globalization. I mean, of course, this is not a recent trend. I think it started 20 years ago or even more. But I think that, you know, the way that this trend collapses with data protection discipline has to do with the concept of international data transfer, naming basically the flowing of data across geographical borders on a worldwide level. And you might think that, oh my God, that looks weird, you know. No, it's actually super common. It's actually really common. If you think about all the time, if you think about online shopping, or maybe all the times that you're browsing on the web, and that, you know, website has servers that are in another continent, for example, US. So that's an international data transfer. And this topic is getting a lot of discussion lately. If we think about the recent event that usually goes by the name of the Max Schrems case law ruling, which completely disrupted the dynamics of the relationship between US and Europe. In fact, before this, basically there was a so-called privacy shield in place in order to protect and support American organizations, you know, when dealing with European citizens' personal data. But the European Court of Justice decided to completely strike down basically this privacy shield and asking to American organizations to comply with the European private contractual clauses. And this is super interesting because this led to a new level of conversation amongst the regulators in order to introduce what's called the transfer impact assessment. You know, just before we talked about the DPIA, the data protection impact assessment. Now there's a lot of fuzz around transfer impact assessment in order to understand beforehand what's the risk, you know, of a specific international data transfer for that specific person. And secondly, an interesting also area is the one that, you know, tries to understand what is the role of GDPR in innovation, you know. And here there are 2 main schools of thought. From one side, we have researchers and professionals, you know, arguing that GDPR tends to suffocate innovation because it requires organizations to master the information flow. And of course, this might sometimes go, as I said before, artificial intelligence and other similar technologies. But from the other side, we have also, you know, more enthusiast, let's say, perspectives that basically argue that GDPR ultimately delivers trust in the way that these technologies are deployed. So it's vital for, you know, the boost of demand of these technologies directly from consumers. A third interesting challenge that I see has to do with the legal challenge. In fact, recently regulators have literally declared wars on cookies, asking website operators, app developers to comply with stricter regulations in terms of defining how to obtain consent in order to use cookies. As you know, cookies are those IT components that are able to track the digital behavior, our digital behavior on the digital properties. So I think it's an interesting conversation, and I personally agree with this in terms of the fact that from one side, I'm really skeptical on actual consent mechanisms, because I don't think that anyone really reads the disclaimers. I don't think anyone really reads that, through. And on the other side, I'm against the cookie wall, the idea of cookie walls. So the idea that in order for being served a digital service, you're forced basically to provide your data processing authorization. I think there should be still discussion around this in order to understand what could be feasible, right? Regrettably, the ransomware growth that we saw in 2020 is here to stay. In fact, right now, amongst all the different, let's say, plethora of cybersecurity attacks, ransomware attack is actually the most common. And again, ransomware attack is that situation where we have basically an attacker penetrating and encrypting an entire system of a business application and asking for money in return of the decryption key. And I think in the legal, let's say, side of the story has to do with the fact that now regulators are really wondering and questioning, how should we, modify, how should we implement, a data breach protocol that should also take into account of such occurrences, because they're not, just a rare thing to happen. It's really common, unfortunately. And lastly, of course, I cannot help mentioning COVID-19. In fact, as the world slowly but surely gets the battle against COVID-19 away, of course, all those myriad of data-driven initiatives that were rushed in to deal with the pandemic will have to be reassessed in terms of legitimate purpose. In fact, I mean, if you think about all the data that has been, held about people's health, status, or maybe all those apps that have been developed in order to track the network of contacts, will have to be reassessed in terms of what's, legitimate purpose now. And if they come out with a secondary potential utilization, the key question now is, for how long should we keep this information if we abide, by the data protection rulings? So I hope that I kind of conveyed the message of how relevant, the conversation around data protection is. And now I will flip the side and I will talk you through, about the way that SAS, gives a hand in that. And I will basically describe you a methodological and technological framework that SAS, enables, thanks to which SAS can enable organizations to really achieve personal data governance and compliance. I will decompose this framework in 4 main pillars. We'll be talking firstly about personal data discovery. So the idea that organizations want to automatize the identification of personal data, and how can we leverage on AI in order to expedite that. We're gonna be talking about personal data compliance. So how can an organization demonstrate compliance, and how can technology support in the orchestration of all the processes that are envisioned by the local, the European data protection law. We're gonna be talking about personal data protection and personal data governance, and I'm gonna squeeze these concepts all together because I think that they are strictly, intertwined between one another, in terms of the fact that I think that in order to enforce a specific data strategy, of course, you're gonna have to protect, and to ensure information security. I'm gonna talk about that. And from the other side, in order to implement technical measures, in order to, protect your data, of course, you have to get, you have to have lots of organization. You have to have a data strategy in place. So we're gonna see, how technology can support in both ideas. So let's start with the first concept, personal data discovery. Before starting, a brief message that I want to say here is that the idea here is that organization, of course, wants to automatize the localization of personal data and so on. But I think that why are we talking about this? Why is that important? I think because identifying personal data is really important, not only if we talk about generic, let's say, personal data, like my name, my email, my social security number. But I think that it's really important if we talk about sensitive personal data, what's defined in the Article 9 of GDPR, because sensitive personal data, in the way that GDPR states, are all those data that are potentially able to reveal delicate aspects about us. Think about my medical history, my religious beliefs or political opinions, and sexual orientation. And I think this is important because people could be, I think that people will always be, willing to protect, and that information from public exposure, because unfortunately we live in a world where still people could be discriminated on the basis of that information. So I just want to say the message that identifying personal data is important because it's part of a bigger concept, which is privacy, and privacy is one of the fundamental rights that we have as human beings. So that's why this is important. So in order to identify personal data, what SAS envisions is a stepwise approach that can be decomposed into this following 4 stages. We're going to talk about data sources connection, personal data identification, results analysis, and inventory. So let's start with the first one. In terms of data sources connection, I just want to say the broad message that SAS can integrate to both open source software, commercial software, be it relational database like Oracle, be it non-relational data source like Hadoop. And this integration functionality can extend to both at-rest data, but also in-motion data like streaming data. And what I think that SAS can offer is the ability to provide access, manage, and process data in a distributed environment in order to, maximize the utilization of computational resources in order to shorten execution times and speed decision-making. And by leveraging also on data virtualization technology, SAS can also foster and simplify security practice, like the centralization of identity access management in one single layer. But enough details for that. In terms of personal data identification, I just want to start with a simple message that let's say here SAS builds on a core foundational intuition. Personal data is nothing else than a pattern. So we might have different personal data types. Therefore, it's all about understanding what is the pattern, for each personal data type. And as much simple as it sounds, of course, it might be more complex if you think about the new digital ways through which we can, interact with organizations in this modern world. If you think about all the times that you provide a comment on the web, or maybe all the times that we interact with digital assistants like Alexa. So I think it's getting even trickier, how to identify personal data. The point here is that I want to make is that we live in a world where personal data, might be lying in structured ecosystems like data warehouse, the traditional concept of data warehouse, databases, where basically each information is neatly organized in a row column fashion. But now we live also in a world where data, could be lying in unstructured ecosystems, where basically each information doesn't have, a position index, whatsoever. So if you think about a collection of images, or if you think about a set of textual information documents, basically, I think that, the kind of, of challenge for identifying personal data might be completely different. But let's start with the idea of images. In case of images, for example, GDPR states that any picture that reveals that plot that that has human faces within it is to be considered personal data. So in this case, what SAS does basically is to leverage on artificial intelligence and specifically on computer vision techniques in order to perform what we call image recognition and object detection. The idea here is to basically automatize the identification on the human face in order to label the picture personal data detected, for example, or not. Instead, if we talk about textual documents, where basically any document where we have natural language within it, here what SAS does is to leverage on what we call natural language processes. So techniques that basically enable organizations to really tailor linguistic rules in order to automatize the extraction of personal information and provide semantical and contextual interpretation of that information. And specifically on this textual data, what SAS offers is in order to accelerate, let's say, this personal data identification is a out-of-the-box matching engine, which basically leverages on data quality functions, and in order to provide what we call a fuzzy matching approach. A fuzzy matching approach might, sound a weird name, but actually means that it's driven not only by this, let's say, this detection engine is not only driven by deterministic rules, but it's also driven by stochastic ones. So the solution will always retrieve, the identified personal data, but also a confidence interval to tell you how confidently the engine is saying that that's personal data. And I think here that it's interesting, the fact that we might have, let's say, many different matching definitions, as there are many different personal data types. In fact, we might have basically a matching definition that revolves around identifying, for example, the account number, the organization's name, but we also might have, matching definition that varies in accordance with the scope of the definition. So when we might have global matching definition. So if you think about the IBAN, or for example, the email, is the pattern of this information is the same, on a worldwide level. But instead, if you think about, let's say, the street address, for example, it's something that might vary, country by country. And plus, I also, the solution leverages on a prior, let's say, acknowledgement of the language. So since day one, the solution already knows, for example, what is a person name, for example, or what is the currency identification, right? So it's interesting to see, that SAS is also always try to cooperate strongly with other institutions. So for example, if you think about the support of the Belgium Supervisory Authority, we can see that basically SAS has adopted an official, let's say, personal data taxonomy that basically enables to identify what is a personal data, what is not personal data, because of course there might be, confusion sometimes around this. And interestingly, I want to make a point that, for example, our digital location. So all the times that basically our smartphones track our position, our geographical position, that's now considered digital personal data. So it's interesting to see, maybe, how many things that we do on a daily basis, has to do with this, this data protection umbrella term. In terms of results analysis, I want to say that, I think it goes without saying that all the times that we rely on automatic engines, that detect things and so on, I think it's important to have always a validation stage. So a stage basically in which we aim to monitor, what's happening, what's, going behind the scenes. And I think that there are many use cases that I could be describing when talking about results analysis, but I think that if there are mostly 3 ideas that I would like to share. The first one is, I called it frequency descriptive, which basically, goes with the question, where is personal data mostly located across my systems, databases, any data source that I have, on my organizations, because this is important because it enables you to really understand how mission critical each system is in terms of data protection, prioritization, activities. So it could be really important. And secondly, I wanted also to briefly touch on the idea of the personal data path tracking visualization, which is basically the idea that it might be helpful, to plot on a visually, basically what is the transformation flow that characterizes a specific data, a personal data, and a specific data, in order to really understand for each layer, for each step of the way, what was the change that was, implemented in the data term, basically. And thirdly, of course, I cannot help mentioning anomalous detection. As I said before, this is a fuzzy approach. So basically means that it's also driven with stochastic, algorithms. And I think there are 2 advantages of this approach. From one side, you have the organizations really have the freedom to basically decide whether they want, how cautious, let's say, or how risk-based they want to be in terms of personal data identification. But on the second side, secondly, I think that fuzzy matching approach is the right approach because it also enables organizations to detect personal data that does not perfectly conform to a specific pattern, which basically means that organizations will be able to track also personal data that they haven't envisioned beforehand. And this might be helpful because maybe we don't have, you know, the crystal clear idea about all the personal data that go through our systems. And so, of course, having a stochastic approach, you need, of course, to detect what might be false positives, false negatives. That is to say, you know, maybe the engine will say, okay, this is a personal data, but it's not, you know, so you might want to handle that in order to further, you know, fine tune your engine. Lastly, once that you have gathered, you know, all the personal data that across your data sources, you know, that revolves around specific, for example, data subject, of course, now you'll be willing to activate data cleansing and data quality operations in order to make sure that you get as much accurate, let's say, view of your attributes of the single data subject. And this is not just a, let's say, data management thing. This is also important because it's actually the key for operationalizing the so-called data subject request. So the right to access, the right to rectification, the right to be forgotten. This, I mean, the only way for which you can operationalize those requests and comply with those is that you have this kind of vision of your data. Secondly, I would like now to start the conversation around personal data compliance. Even here, I kind of like decompose this process in different stages. We're going to talk about inventory, risk management, remediation, data subject communications, and the role of dashboards. Even again, here, the underlying idea is that organizations want to demonstrate compliance. So let's try to understand together how can technology, you know, support in that. The first concept has to do with the Article 30 of Gdpr, which, you know, introduces the concept of the records of processing activities, namely the idea that each organization should understand what are all the data processing that they need to perform, they need to put in place in order to achieve a specific business mission. And here, I think it's interesting because the regulators established that basically for each data processing, you need to understand what's the data that is involved, what are the different roles in terms of data processor, data controller, data protection officer, what is the purpose of the data processing? We touched on before about this concept. And also, for how long do you intend to keep that information? And so it's interesting to see here that the way that SAS can accelerate and expedite during this, you know, sometimes cumbersome stage is basically by offering interfaces that from one side can, you know, support in the massive import of data coming from data sources, but SAS can also support in the realization of data entry interfaces that can really walk the user through all the different information that are mandated to be, you know, provided in terms of this specific requirement. And also, as you can imagine, this is not a one-role task. So it's not something that, you know, just a single person has to do, but it requires organization and cooperation, you know, across different roles and responsibilities. So I think here this matches well with a specific capability of this solution, which is the ability to basically personalize in terms of workflow management. So the ability to personalize the workflow in such a way to perfectly match with the business model of the organization. So this might be interesting to consider. Secondly, of course, we've established that specific data processing, for example, is automatic. It's based on profile, customer profiling. Of course, that's going to be considered, you know, high risk in terms of data subject rights and freedoms. So of course, a DPIA is mandated to be executed. In this case, of course, from a regulator's perspective, there's a lot to deal with in terms of identifying all the different components of this measure in terms of inherent risk, controls maturity, and residual risk. But I think that it's interesting here to say that what SAS offers in order to support with that is basically having the chance to decentralize this risk assessment across many different stakeholders, like risk owners, control owners, in order to make sure that your assessment is as much accurate as possible, of course. And also having the possibility, thanks to screen definitions, to personalizing the interfaces and the questions that you pose in accordance with specific, ideas that you have. Of course, in case that a specific, let's say, residual risk exposure is still considered to be relevant, is to be against the risk tolerance of the organization, of course, the organization will be more than willing to implement further mitigation actions. In this case, from a regulator's perspective, it's all about understanding what are the issues and what are the action plans that you want to formalize. But on a technological level, I think that what really could expedite this process is, of course, having dedicated interfaces for any single of these concepts, is also the idea of correspondence management. The idea that the solution basically is able to archive, and keep for compliance purposes all the communications, all the inquiries that occur across the different roles of the organization. So, for example, if I receive a question coming from a specific, for example, from the data protection officer inquiring about, the status of a specific mitigation action, that should be, of course, kept, under the compliance, kind of like perspective. And then, of course, we have the core of personal data compliance, which is the idea that we should be able to answer to all the requests that could come from, data subjects. And I think it's interesting here because with the regulations establishes that basically you don't only have to basically answer to the question, but you also have to demonstrate to the European Data Protection Authority or to the national protection authorities that you have fulfilled the request in a compliant way. So basically here it's all about, keeping that information in one single environment and making sure that this information could be triggered both in case of external requests, like the one coming from data subjects, but also internally, because if you think about the process of data breach management, it's up to the organization, to understand when, they should notify data protection authorities about the happening of the data breach. And lastly, the idea about dashboards is all about the concept of course, organizations internally, they would want to promote collaboration and communications across different, roles. If you think about auditors, if you think about regulators, if you think about internal stakeholders. And the idea here is that it could really help having dashboards that could provide from one side aggregated views about risk exposures, just to give, the so-called the pitch elevator kind of understanding. But from the other side, also having, the possibility to get point-wise information, detailed information about your personal data compliance. And here the accelerator comes in the fact that the solution offers the possibility to interact visually, with the data in order to really, customize your question and getting the answer that you need. And of course, here SAS offers out-of-the-box visualizations that are already, let's say, prepped for personal data compliance purposes, but also offers the possibility to customize further your visualizations in order to get your questions straight. In terms of personal data governance and protection, here I squeeze these two ideas all together because, as I said before, I think that they are strictly intertwined, because in order to ensure data strategy, you need to have technical measures to protect the data and vice versa. In terms of personal data protection, again, here the idea is that you want to make sure that you prevent, let's say, unauthorized access to your data, unauthorized manipulation, unauthorized deletion of your data. Here, SAS can offer different capabilities, starting from, for example, as I said before, data access centralization. So having the possibility to centralize the access in one single layer in order to foster and simplify security practices. We can be talking about data masking techniques. So SAS offers techniques to protect your data, and both reversible ones like pseudonymization, encryption, but also irreversible ones like anonymization, generalization, and hashing. And also another key aspect, if you think about the data minimization principle, SAS can also support organizations by leveraging on data virtualization technology in basically personalize the kind of views of the data that each role has, and really, tailor that view to the role and responsibilities and authorization of that specific user within the organization. And lastly, of course, each activity within the solution is tracked. If you think about query access in any activity is tracked down in order for enabling further inspections, if that's the case. In terms of data governance, the key idea that I want to say here is that in order to, of course, the organizations will want to have a data strategy in place when dealing with all this, crazy things. And in order to enforce that data strategy, the organizations needs to have, policies, agreements, rules. And I think that, we might really, need, technological accelerators, in order to support with that. And I think four key ideas are the concept of data lineage. So the idea that you can visually plot all the data elements you have, and basically understand the interconnections between one another visually. And this data element could be, SaaS applications, but they also could be, third-party applications. So we're agnostic from that standpoint. And then we have the core, I think, the ingredient of a good data governance program, which is the idea around business data glossary, which is a technological idea. So the fact that I should formalize for all the business domains, what are my business terms, what's the definition of each term, and what are the attributes that relate with that term, and mostly, what are the relationships of this term with the others, in order to have a standardized, homogenized practice and dictionary across my organization. And thirdly, I think it's also key the concept of the remediation hub, which basically is really technological, which basically means that given that you have behind the scenes certain data quality rules, triggered on a systematic basis, you might be willing to have a specific interface for specific roles like data stewards to have the chance to really, get in details about all the data quality deviations that were, tracked by the solution and remediate, fix those problems, directly. And lastly, I wanted to touch the concept of data quality dashboard. So here, the basic idea is that in order to promote the culture of data quality, you need to have simple visualizations that tell the story, that cut the story short. And I think here it's interesting to see that it also could enable, point-wise understanding about what data quality actually means in terms of accuracy, completeness, and integrity. Okay, so I pretty much touched on all the concepts that I wanted to cover today. I really thank you for your attention, and please, if you have questions, don't hesitate to get those questions to me, or even if you want after the webinar, if you want to contact me on my email, please feel free, and I will get the stage back to you, Tanya.
Oh, thank you very much. Very impressive presentation. You haven't lost not one attendee when you start to present a technical part of the presentation. So that is good. Usually it is not like that. At least 5 to 10 people left the presentation when see the technical solution. I do have a few questions I have received from my colleagues, which didn't send through this application, through Zoom. It is one what maybe I have not understood completely. A connection with the core solution of the, for example, bank is possible of this solution. That is one question. And the second question is this data bridge report, which is produced, if I understood correctly, automatically, whether it is provided to some person to additionally cross-check whether it is all fine and to make how to say some correction before sending out to the Commissioner of Data Protection. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for the questions. Yeah.
I hope so.
I will start with first question. Of course, when we talk about, as I said, data access capabilities in terms of SAS, I just want to start with the idea that SAS exists, has existed for 43 years now. So I think that we kind of experienced, all the evolutions in terms of data landscape. So definitely the answer is yes. SAS can provide access to both relational data sources and non-relational data sources, any kind of open source or commercial software. And in terms of the second question, yeah, you're welcome. In terms of the second questions, instead, I want to just say that it's interesting that this question came up because it's always asked. So it's something that we always get to receive in terms of attention points, because of course, whenever we talk about a compliance solution, it doesn't exist a one-size-fits-all kind of situation. Yeah. The solution is always, of course, starts from, let's say, a prior, let's say, understanding of what the situation might be like, a prior understanding of what the process should be structured like. But I think it's key, in support, of course, of us, customer advisor, to really, fine tune and tailor the solution to the processes of the customer. So, and here again, I want to touch on the idea that our solution in terms of personal data compliance is completely customizable, both in terms of screen definitions, so the way that the information are structured, the layout, everything of that sort, but also in terms of what the process is like. So we have specific capabilities in terms of workflow management that deal with those, kind of requirements.
With certain rules of improvement, etc. Yeah.
Yeah. Of course.
Clear. Thanks very much. Very
You're welcome.
fine. I have understood everything from most probably my colleagues as well. Thank you very much, David. I would like to call my colleagues to stay or to join us again in 1 o'clock. We have a presentation regarding ISO standard for anti-corruption. So basically another topic which is very interesting for compliance people. And afterwards we will have also a presentation from the Agency for Anti-Corruption. So that was that for this day, and thank you very much, David, for this nice presentation.
Welcome.
I hope so that my colleagues, if they still have some questions, they will send you an email. I can provide them if they want to make a connection with you. Thank you very much.